Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice is or Centro para la Justicia Global, is a research and learning center for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. We are located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. Due to the pandemic, we have discontinued our normal in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program is the 30th webinar since June 1. Let me take a moment to preview our upcoming attractions. I'll just display a little screen here. Next Monday at this same time, we will have a webinar on Medicare for All with Dr. Margaret Flowers, who is a leading advocate of single-payer universal health care. The following Monday, we will be having, the following Monday is December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. We will be honored to have the noted historian Peter Kuznick, who will talk about the dangerous myths surrounding World War II and how they have contributed to the existential crises facing humanity today. You may remember Peter Kuznick from his collaboration with Oliver Stone on the documentary series, The Untold History of the United States. And then the following Monday, December 14th, we round out the year with a webinar on expanding the commons, democratic public goods, featuring philosopher Nancy Holmstrom and sociologist Dario Azzolini. So we have those three exciting programs coming up, and we'll take a break for the holidays after that one and resume in January with more educational programs of great interest. Today's program on the environmental crisis, radical responses to it, has been organized by Victor Wallis, well known for his editing of the journal Socialism and Democracy. Victor is professor of political science at the Berklee College of Music and author of Red-Green Revolution, the Politics and Technology of Ecosocialism. That came out in 2018. The next year, he came out with Democracy Denied, 5 lectures on US politics. And then the following year, Socialist Practice, Histories and Theories. Obviously, he's been very busy. Victor will be introducing his 2 fellow panelists. So let me turn the floor over to you, Victor.
Thank you very much, Cliff. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate your organizing work on this I just want to make a few general remarks before I introduce the speakers. I think we all come to this in a sense with an awareness that addressing the ecological crisis appropriately calls into question and indeed calls for transcending capitalism. This doesn't mean that important positive things can't be done before that, but they should be consistent with and guided by, in a sense, that longer range vision. I think that's important to know. And in my book, Red Green Revolution, one of the main things I stressed is that while we all recognize the need for changing the forms of energy that are used, that this alone is not enough. There has to be a reduction in the general footprint, which calls into question the throughput of resources and the utilization of space in the world, and reconfiguring all that using fewer resources, arranging space in a way that's more conducive to natural processes. This requires really a fundamental social transformation. And this is the background to what we're going to be talking about today, the social transformation. And the absolute precondition for that, or the requirement for continuing it, is that there be massive popular involvement in the process. One can't change one's whole way of life without being part of the process itself. And this is necessary not only to bring about the transformation politically initially, but also to sustain the form of let's say, the new form of society that we bring into being. In other words, it has to be a participatory form, which will presumably, if it is sufficiently participatory, take care of the issues of planning that were so problematic in cases where the planning was done on a limited, sort of by a limited group of essentially bureaucratically placed people. There has to be a new awareness of the need for everybody to be involved. There have to be structures whereby they can do so. And more generally, in terms of bringing about this massive participation, which we have to be doing right now, I would comment that the existence of the pandemic and the massive preoccupation with that has, I think, provided a kind of opening where we can get people used to the idea that the emergency created by the environmental crisis is something of equal importance and requires equally constant and continuing attention. And we hear a president-elect speaking of surrounding himself with scientific advisors about the pandemic. Why not scientific advisors about the whole issue of the environment and the drastic changes that are necessary to bring that about? But in order to bring about the kind of movement that will be able to apply that kind of pressure, people have to be able to recognize the links between all the other issues that they face in the society and the environmental issue. And that's one of the things I tried to work on in my book. And we'll hear, I think, some things about that also today. But underlying all these is an awareness of the class dimension of the environmental crisis. The fact that although the environmental issue affects everybody and that everybody needs the transformation, there's a definite class that has an interest in blocking the measures that are necessary to bring this about. And that's, of course, the capitalist class. So that, of course, I think is maybe I can say an article of consensus among us. But then nonetheless, this still leaves open the question of what concrete measures, what concrete approaches, what technologies have to be applied and how much these can accomplish. And this is where I think it's particularly important to have deep insight into the phenomenon of biodiversity, the whole challenge of how to recapture biodiversity. And that's been a major consideration for me in thinking of whom to invite to join us on this panel. So I'm really delighted that we have Fred Magdoff and Mauricio Betancourt. And Fred Magdoff, who has co-authored the book, What Every Environmentalist Needs to Know About Capitalism, and then more recently, Creating an Ecological Society Towards a Revolutionary Transformation. He will give a kind of overview, going into some depth about the background to the whole this, and especially focusing on his expertise, which is in the sphere of really agroecology. And then Mauricio Betancourt will talk about a specific experience of this, an application in Cuba. Mauricio is from Mexico. He is a Ph.D. candidate writing a dissertation with John Bellamy Foster, and he has had some studies in biology and in philosophy of science, and has also worked on an agroecology project in Oaxaca, but he's going to focus on the case of Cuba. So these are the two. So Fred Magdoff will speak for about a half hour, and Mauricio for about 15 minutes, and then I'll come back with a few comments to introduce a general discussion. So, Fred. Can you unmute yourself?
Of course, I muted myself, and now I just unmuted. Thanks, Victor, and I will touch on some of the things that Victor has talked about, because I think it's important to understand what is it about capitalism that's the problem. Some people just say it's just having a growth paradigm, that somehow we just believe religiously in growth or something like that. There are other variations on that theme. That's the problem. But really the issue is how the system functions at its most basic. The whole purpose of capitalism is to make something in order to sell it at a profit in order to generate more capital than you started with at the beginning. That's the whole purpose of the system. That's the whole purpose of production in the system. So this is, out of that, this impels growth. Growth is a central part of capitalism. When it's not growing, it's in crisis. And even if it's slow growth, it can be in crisis. And so this is a major problem. It's a system that knows no physical boundaries or no biological limits, and it just keeps going as a juggernaut, which creates more and more social and ecological problems. People confront, I'm not going to talk about the various ecological issues, which I think people who are watching this are quite aware of, and how the severity of them, which is extraordinary. But I'd like to just talk about how the normal response of many people to the crisis is that they turn to some sort of regulations. We need to regulate this or regulate that, and there's no question, I think, as Victor alluded to, that there are regulations. That things, certainly the water in the United States is better than it had been. The surface waters is still polluted with pesticides and with fertilizer, but it's better than it had been. The air is better than it had been, still with a major pollution problem, especially in areas of, they tend to be of people of color that are near highways, near plants that produce petrochemicals, etc. So the problem is that with these regulations, they never go far enough. Usually they're designed by the companies that are being regulated, and therefore they're not very strong to start with. They're not usually enforced very well, etc. So there's no real way, in my opinion, and we can talk about this, to regulate ourselves out of the problem within the system of capitalism. But how do we overcome the power of the very powerful? That is, I just grabbed this out of a study, which was, I think, came out yesterday or the day before, or an article about it did, that large firms and the 1% drive US policy. The general public opinion is absolutely irrelevant. So that you have very powerful economic and political interests, which have to be met and have to be dealt with, which will bring me later to an issue that Victor has raised. So in reality, the only thing to do is to make some drastic changes. And you could say, well, we could make some of those changes in capitalism, like the Green New Deal is being talked about. And I think that's something that is in the United States important to push, important to try to do whatever we can within the system and try to push the system to its limits, if you will. But trying to do the transition from fossil fuels to renewables within the capitalist system is very problematic. And possibly, well, can't say it can't be done, but won't happen in the time that's needed for it to happen. First, it's a huge task, requiring an incredible amount of investment, each of the technologies has its own effects that are potentially negative on the environment. Also, nowadays, when renewable capacity is added, electrical generating capacity, it usually just is an addition to the electrical grid, and it doesn't replace fossil fuels. Third, what is desperately needed is a rapid decrease in the use of fossil fuels at the same time as the renewable energy capacity is added. This means we have to have a reduction of the wealthy, which I'm going to get to in a second, why I'm talking about that, as well as stranded assets. In other words, this means that companies, corporations right now, that own coal, that own oil, that own gas that's in the ground, have to be told that they can't take it out, or they have to slow down the rate of extraction drastically until it becomes zero. So what we're talking about, confiscating the wealth of very powerful corporations and people. So the greatest short-term impact that you can have with regard to reducing environmental damage, I'm talking about now with regard to climate change, but it also, climate destabilization, also refers to other types of degradation, is to decrease the pollution that is caused by the wealthiest people in the society. There was just an article in The Guardian of Britain from November 17th. I don't know if this is the headline, but I took it right out of it. This is a direct quote. 1% of the people cause half of global aviation emissions. Well, that's just incredible. You know, and aviation is a major emitter of global of greenhouse gases. According to the World Bank, this is a 2005 figure, so I don't know if it was accurate then, and it's certainly out of date by now. But they estimated that the top 10% in wealth in the world used approximately 6% of the world's resources. Okay, my guess is it's much higher than that. But let's just go with that number, and let's assume that the pollution that's generated on a world basis, that 60% of it is due to this 10%. So this is not just the 1%, this is 10%. If that 10%, the highest 10%, the wealthiest, were to consume just like the next 10% down, okay? In other words, we're not talking about poverty or anything like that. You could reduce the resource use and emissions probably by around 30 to 40%. So this is I think we have to understand that the 1% are certainly using a lot of the resources, but it's not just the 1%. It's also others that are wealthy, not in all countries across the world. The wealthy in China, the wealthy in India, the wealthy in the United States and in Mexico, wherever. It's not easy to curb the standard of living of wealthy people within a capitalist society. In fact, it may be impossible, just because they have so much power, which is one of the critical issues. So my take, and I think the others on this panel, is that what's needed is an entirely different system, economic and political and social system. In capitalism, the public, that is humans, are at the service of the economy. Of course, that's the purpose of the natural world as a whole, of which we're part, is to be at the service of profit making. And you're also supposed to be good workers and prolific consumers in order to keep the function going. So the profit potential is the deciding factor in what gets produced and how it gets produced and where it gets produced. And so these decisions are made with that in mind. Where can you make the most money? So what's needed as far as a society, an ecological society and a socially just one, is a society in which it's sort of turned on its head. Instead of it being at the service of capital, of the economy of capitalists and of capitalists, the economy and society needs to be organized so it's under social control and at the service of humanity. And by the way, when I talk about the service of humanity, I include a healthy ecosystem in that, because we need, as other biological organisms do, a healthy ecosystem, fully functioning with all the natural flows and cycles that are working well and reasonably stable. So the purpose of this economy should be to provide everyone with what's needed for a good life, which has to be socially defined and democratically defined, such as decent and comfortable housing, an adequate supply and good quality of food, education, healthcare, recreation, cultural programs. There's no need to go on producing ever more stuff once the needs of people are met. And that is something that's different from capitalism very much, because capitalism has to go on producing more stuff and has to go on pushing that stuff on people. In such a system, the power will be not in the hands of private individuals, but will be in the hands of public, that is, social control. Such a system will not have the internal compulsion for exponential growth, but rather function to regenerate and maintain the health of the biosphere upon we and other species depend. Some say that this so-called human nature precludes such a society. But what's usually referred to as human nature is actually just a subset of characteristics that are prominent in a given society. The characteristics that are prominent in a capitalist society and actually needed to function well in a capitalist society, these are greed, selfishness, individualism, and competitiveness. These are rewarded by the system. But in a eco-socialist economy, or an economy under social control, where the purpose is to satisfy people's basic needs, the subset of characteristics of cooperation, reciprocity, solidarity, empathy, altruism need to be encouraged, while others need to be suppressed. And by the way, they were encouraged during the hunting-gathering societies. So the characteristics that were so important for us as a species to begin and to live most of our lives as a species, that is for, over 250, 60,000 years as a species, those are the characteristics that we need in a social society, a society whose goal is to meet the social needs of the population in environmentally sound ways. Well, what would be the characteristics of such a society under social control? And this would be, another terminology is, as I mentioned, eco-socialist or socialist society. Well, it has to be based on cooperation, as I mentioned, and reciprocity instead of competition and selfishness, and on a dedication to achieving substantive equality. That the free development of each person is predicated on the free development of all, the full development of all. So we need, as Victor alluded to early on, profound democracy, not a fake democracy like we have in the United States, where most of what happens as far as policy issues and the direction of government has nothing to do with what people want. Okay, this is a study that I alluded to earlier. We need to have basically a bottom-up system that also has a top, though. There has to be some sort of a structure to it where people are in charge, people at the community level and at the regional level, and maybe at some multi-regional level as well. And there has to be worker control and management of production with communities having input into what happens in their communities, not just the workers in the plants. And I think something that's really important in such a society is also the rotation of responsibilities. This is something that I've had arguments with people about, and I don't think it happens in many cooperatives. But I think it's a critical issue for people not to be stuck in the same position all the time, but to rotate jobs, to rotate into managing and to keeping books and doing things like that, and to rotate into different types of positions within the enterprise, whatever it is. It's needed for transparency, and it's needed for basically to provide a variety of experiences and responsibilities to people. Planning, which is something Victor mentioned, is something that's absolutely essential, that you can't have a society that has a social need to produce and not have planning. Markets can't decide such a thing. They make no sense as a decision-making process of what to produce and how to produce, if the goal is to provide everybody with what is needed for a good life, buen vivir. So this planning has to start at the local level. There has to be regional planning, and there has to be, obviously, multi-regional planning. Not every community, not every region is necessarily going to be producing buses. There has to be some things that get produced, not everywhere. But we should try to produce what we can to provide what people need as close as possible to where the population is. We need to try to integrate natural areas with urban areas. And this is urban agriculture as part of that, but also possibilities for recreation that many people in urban areas don't enjoy at this point. And then I think we need an ecologically based management of the resources, such as agriculture. And this is something that Mauricio is going to be talking about fairly soon. We have to learn from nature, and this is, I think, what agroecology is about, and what ecological agriculture is about, is learning from nature. How does it operate? How does it maintain relatively stable ecosystems? And how can we use these insights to allow humans to interact with each other and with the rest of nature while we're providing goods and services that we need for society? This is one of the critical things, and this is, to me, in agriculture, is what we're trying to do. In essence, is trying to mimic the function of natural, undisturbed ecosystems, but doing it in such a way as to raise food for people to eat. And by the way, a high quantity and quality of food can be raised that way. There needs to be environmental remediation and regeneration. There are so many contaminated sites around the country, around the world, that need to be remediated. And I think such a society also would give prioritization to alleviating the miseries of what Eduardo Galeano called the nobodies, the people that Fritz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. That this is really, we need to do that. There are people who should have priority when there is a transformation, and we have to try to lessen the severe conditions under which these people are, severe adverse conditions under which these people are living. So I can talk about, if people want to, in the discussion about soils and the whole issue of how you manage ecosystems and how you do that in such a way as to encourage beneficial organisms and discourage the organisms that are potentially harmful to plants or animals that we are interested in utilizing. So this is a subject that can come up. If Mauricio talks about it, it's fine. Another thing that Victor alluded to, which I just wanted to talk a little bit about, is the question of how do you get to an eco-socialist society? And I think that the only way is through a massive movement that incorporates all people who want to change the negative social and ecological effects that we are suffering under in capitalism. The problem that we have, at least in the United States, and I can't speak for the other countries, is that we have literally thousands and probably tens of thousands of organizations, of groups at community levels, at state levels, maybe national level, in which they are take on one particular issue, okay, social or ecological issue, and they may be important issues, you know, of sexism or racism or you know, homophobia or contamination of the air or whatever the issues are. These are all important issues, but these are fragmented groups, and somehow this needs to be unified. We need to have, in order to create a critical mass of people to take on the power that exists within the capitalist society, you need to get all of the people that are concerned about the social and ecological problems that we're having. We have to get them together, and we have to get them to the understanding, which I think is real, that these problems are not going to be solved individually, that they're going to be solved together when we are able to build a new society. That each group needs to come to the understanding that the issue of the other group is also their issue. Okay? That racism, sexism, poverty, hunger, local, regional, and global ecological destruction, including obviously climate destabilization, these are not separate issues. They are intertwined, and they are all enhanced in magnitude or caused by the system of capitalism. And therefore, you need to have a new society in order to deal with all of it. So this is not something also during the struggle that's going to have to go on. We can't just wait and see what's going to happen at the end of the struggle. We need to do things now. We need to try new projects now, like agroecological projects at a local level, either within a socialist society or not within a socialist society. We have to try to develop new ways of behaving to each other. There are groups that are doing this, like the Kurds in their struggle and I think the Zapatistas as well, if I'm not mistaken. And I know this is happening in with the MST in Brazil, that they're working on issues such as male-female relations and trying to overcome the machismo in the society, trying to uplift the participation of women and their ability to contribute to the whole society. So there are things like that that need to be dealt with as we are trying to change. We need to also help to encourage this type of change to occur as well. At that, I think I will quit and turn it over to Mauricio, who will give you an idea of some concrete activities that are occurring within Cuba, but also they happen in other places too. Agroecology is something which is being applied in other countries of the world as well. Mauricio.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Fred, and thank you also, Victor, for inviting me, and Cliff for organizing this, and Fred for your help with my research on Cuban agroecology. So I'll start building on what Fred has said, and I want to talk about a concrete example from agriculture today as to how ecological production can occur. So I will discuss agroecology in general and Cuban agroecology in particular, and also the relation of Cuban agroecology to one project I was involved in Oaxaca, Mexico. The first thing I like to say is that agroecology can be understood in different ways, either as a science, that is, as the analysis of the ecological relationships occurring within a particular plot or field, as a technique merely equivalent to input substitution, or as a movement, that is, as a social and political way of organizing food production, what to grow and how and for whom too. I think the most holistic way of understanding agroecology involves a combination of the three approaches, but paying primary attention to its character as a movement. That is, agroecology considers the field and farm as ecosystems to be managed using practices learned from natural systems, paying primary attention to restoring soil quality, reducing tillage, using polycropping, improving nutrient cycling through the use of cover crops and other techniques, all while, and this is very important, while attaining people's nutritional needs. So agroecology has similarities to organic farming, but agroecology, and this is unique, stresses social issues and indigenous knowledge. And agroecology is actually, as Fred was saying, currently practiced in countless places, mainly within Africa, Asia, Latin America. For instance, the Zapatistas in the mountains of southeastern Mexico carried out, as do the landless workers movement peasants in Brazil, or the international peasant movement La Via Campesina. Yet, it is in Cuba where agroecology has been developed to a greater extent through a countrywide movement, a countrywide peasant-to-peasant, or campesino, a campesino in Spanish, movement that is supported by the state. And curiously, in fact, this peasant-to-peasant movement originated in the early 1970s in Guatemala through the work of Mayan Cachiquel peasants. And years later, 5 Mexican peasants from a community called Vicente Guerrero in Tlaxcala traveled to Guatemala to learn about soil conservation. And it was in Nicaragua where this farmer-to-farmer movement thrived. So as Eric Cole Jimenez would put it, the peasant-to-peasant movement has Mayan roots, Mexican branches, and Nicaraguan fruits. But it is in Cuba that it has been most successful. So we could wonder, why is that? And long story short, agroecology was gradually adopted in this country after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in late 1991, from which Cuba imported most of its agricultural inputs, and it depended on it for trading petroleum, industrial equipment, pesticides, fertilizer, foodstuffs, and so on. So after the dissolution of the USSR, Cuba's GDP fell by almost 35%. This country lost 85% of its trade relations and 70% of its imports. So basically, food production collapsed. And in addition to that, the United States strengthened its economic sanctions, exercised through the so-called Cuban democracy and the Helms-Burton Acts. And yet, in spite or in the midst of this state of affairs, Cuba was surprisingly able to overcome this acute crisis known as the special period in time of peace, a sort of warlike economy, whereby drastic changes were carried out by the Cubans in order to rearrange the country's economy, particularly, although not only in the peasant sector. And for example, US ecologist Richard Levins argued that the ecological transformations in Cuban agriculture since the early 1990s are actually overwhelmingly complex. They include changes in agrotechnology, land tenure and use, social organization of production and research, education, and so on. But agroecology in this country became as it's been called, to a revolution within a revolution, right? An agroecological revolution within a socialist revolution, which was, by the way, not an improvised emergency reaction to a special period, but a strategy that had its roots in the transformation of Cuban society as a whole and its scientific institutions since the triumph of the revolution in 59. So that's what Levins and Lewontin argue of ecologists by necessity transforming or turning into ecologists by conviction. And a crucial part of this agroecological revolution was that the cooperatives of the National Association of Small Farmers, the ANAP, which is a federation that was formed in 1961 for farmers with less than 67 hectares of land, they adopted this foregoing campesino to campesino agroecology movement. And this association ever since has been absolutely crucial in the development of agroecology in Cuba. What happened is that after participating in workshops with peasants from Mexico and Nicaragua and Guatemala, virtually all of the members of the ANAP became part of the peasant-to-peasant movement. And I think this is crucial, and this is partly why is it that Cuba stands alone in terms of agroecology, because here it is it is a countrywide movement that is supported and encouraged by the state, unlike virtually elsewhere, where capitalist states and their government seeks the capitalist states and their government seek agro-industrial approaches to food production. So they are therefore the antagonist of any agroecological movements that may be occurring within. Whereas in Cuba, there is a symbiotic relationship, if you will, between the state and the peasant-to-peasant movement, and they reinforce each other. And in many ways that we could further discuss, but at any rate, we can say that today the ANAP is constituted by more than 330,000 members who actually produce more than 65% of the food, of the country's food, in only 25% of the land. Of course, I like to note that the Cubans had already been turning their attention to alternative modes of food production before 91. And thus some of the conditions to produce such a swift transition were already present in the country. And otherwise, of course, the shift would have simply been impossible. But nonetheless, Cuba not only recovered after adopting agroecology, but showed the best performance in all of Latin America and the Caribbean, with a more than 4% per capita annual food production after 91 relative to pre-1991 levels. And it also attained its highest ever production levels for 10 out of the 13 basic food articles in the national diet. And remarkably, at the same time, undernourishment, which had dropped after the 1959 revolution and abruptly rose again during the special period to affect almost 20% of the population, decreased once again in just 5 years to values lower than 5%, as those in any affluent nation, and have been kept in below 2.5% since 2014. So, well, and as Fred was mentioning too, Cuba has also developed an important urban agroecology program, which is managed through agroecological practices across a variety of city systems, such as organoponics, intensive gardens, and parcel plots, which produce more than 1.5 million tons of vegetables in more than 380,000 farms, supplying at least 70% of fresh vegetables in Havana, in Santa Clara, and other cities, contributing about 5% of Cuba's total production. And this is why, according to Fernando Funes, a Cuban agroecologist, and I quote, "No other country in the world has achieved this level of success with a form of agriculture that reduces energy use and effectively closes local production and consumption cycles." End of quote. So what Funes was saying here is basically that agroecology is able to mitigate what sociologist John Bellamy Foster has called, following Karl Marx, the metabolic rift in agriculture, right? The closing of this contradiction between town and country and the systematic siphoning of nutrients from the countryside into the cities. And moreover, for instance, the World Wildlife Fund Sustainability Index report of 2006 cited Cuba as the only sustainable country on Earth, which is in itself yet another remarkable result of agroecology, right? While preserving the health of the land, all while attaining people's nutritional needs. And of course, another crucial aspect of agroecology related to what Victor was mentioning is that agroecology is not only an important approach to solving these two issues, but also it's deeply related to biodiversity conservation, which of course is a huge topic in and of itself. that has been extensively studied by agroecologists, by Yvette Perfecto or John van der Meer in Michigan, or Angus Ryan, Miguel Altieri in California, or Fred himself here, among many others. But the only thing related to this that I like to mention is that in Cuba, in contrast to basically the rest of the world, there is more forest land today, about 10% more, than there was 30 years ago, something that few countries in the world can say, which is of course related itself to the false land sharing, land sparing debate in agroecology. But what is remarkable here is thus that agroecology appears to be not only a more sustainable way of food production in terms of mitigating the metabolic rift, but also pertaining deforestation, climate change, and biodiversity loss. And without having to resort to these non-existent geoengineering technologies of capitalism, right? Here's a crucial part of the solution already in existence. And the last thing I want to mention about Cuban agroecology, perhaps the most important one, is that it is no coincidence that so far the transition as the Cubans shift to agroecology has not been observed anywhere else on the planet on a large scale, even though there are countless of agroecological movements. And this is because the success of Cuban agroecology is not only due to the application of alternative agricultural techniques, but also to a profound countrywide social transformation of production, of distribution, of exchange, and of consumption. That is, to the underlying socialist organization of the country, right? And in that vein, I would like to quote here Orlando Lugo, who is a former president of the ANAP, who said, and I quote again, "We have the conviction that for this progress, there has been a major conditioning factor, the revolution, which gave us and guaranteed us the possession of land, which developed us academically, technically, and socially, which instilled in us the values of collectivism, cooperation, and solidarity." Similarly, for instance, Luis Gomez, who is the president of the Cuban Society of Science and Soils, said that the Cuban peasantry is currently in a very favorable situation, especially because the country has understood that sovereignty is also food sovereignty. And I think they both hit the nail on the head with those remarks, explaining the overarching implications of agroecology and the relationship to all other economic structures in Cuba. And of course, Cuba has many challenges and contradictions to solve within and without the realm of agriculture. But what this country has achieved, this revolution within a revolution, is truly remarkable and very important. And lastly, of course, one of the aims of the Cubans and the ANAP agroecologists in particular is that others emulate what they've done in a way that is appropriate to their own circumstances. And that's how a group of students, researchers, peasants, activists, of which I was part, organized and encountered on agroecology in the town of Zaachila in Oaxaca, Mexico during 2015, in order to discuss, for instance, how can schools and universities work hand in hand with producers, both within classrooms and in the countryside, or how to implement practices for water, soil, and biodiversity conservation, or how to organize to defend the land and local crops, or how to establish tighter links between peasant production and consumption so as to close cycles, mitigating this rift. And after that, several agroecology fairs or agroecology promoters or techniques were implemented or carried out. Some theses and research has been done there. And about that, let me show you some slides very quickly. And so let me try and share my screen with you here. So can you all see my my screen? Great. Yes. So well, these are just some of the logos of some of the most important organizations that carry out agroecology that were mentioned by Fred or Victor, right? The movement of landless rural workers in Brazil, or the Zapatistas in Mexico, or La Via Campesina, or the ANAP in Cuba. Here we have a picture of an agroecological plot in the province of Eugene in Cuba, where they're planting some maize here, and you can see a live barrier, a very common agroecological technique here. And here, this was part of a research I made, where you can see in blue the trends of synthetic fertilizer use in many countries in Latin America throughout the last 50 years. And in green, you can see the yield of maize and beans, which are very important crops in the region in general. And the red dotted vertical line represents the dissolution of the USSR. But what I just wanted to emphasize here is that for the most part, in general, you see a positive association between fertilizer use and yield, except in Cuba. Look how Cuba stands alone in terms of having this like jaw-like structure, where synthetic fertilizer use has decreased abruptly, about 72% on average relative to pre-1901 levels. But the yield of crops of these two crops, maize and beans, has actually increased more than 100% relative to pre-1991 levels. And nowhere else in the continent you can see these trends, which are truly remarkable. Of course, in Jamaica and Dominican Republic, there are slightly similar things happening, but not quite as in Cuba, which has this jaw-like structure, which is pretty unique. And relative to that is, of course, the biodiversity conservation scheme. Very rapidly, you can see that biodiversity is a way out of this, agroecology is a way out of this dilemma, in which potentially you could have both high food security of sovereignty and high biodiversity at the same time, as opposed to industrial agriculture mindsets where they necessarily entail an either or, right? Either you preserve biodiversity or you produce food. Agroecology allows you to solve both issues at the same time. The next one is what I was talking about, which I think where Cuba is truly remarkable yet again, is here in gold, in this golden color, you can see the agricultural land in Cuba has slightly diminished during the last 30 years. And here in dark, in the salmon color here, you can see how agricultural land has slightly increased in the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean, excluding Cuba. But on average in the continent, excluding Cuba as a whole, this dark green color here shows how forest land has been decreasing in the rest of the continent. But look at Cuba here in the light green color, how forest land has actually increased significantly in Cuba, as opposed to the rest of the continent on average. This is finally the picture of the encounter in agroecology we made in Oaxaca, which brought people from I think every state in Mexico and also from overseas to try and emulate and take this knowledge to their own communities, to try and organize to develop agroecology in our own circumstances, and trying to practice all of these values that Fred was talking about. So basically the message is this, right? The world has a lot of learn from Cuba, which has time and again showed us that another world is possible and actually already exists within our own. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both Fred and you, Mauricio, for your very interesting presentations. I mean, on the one hand, we see that the fossil fuels have to be left in the ground, which is a huge political struggle. And on the other hand, we see the positive or proactive dimension of a new approach to agriculture, which flies in the face of capitalist practice and which has been shown to actually work. And I'm extraordinarily hopeful for the future on the basis of these experiences of agroecology. And I guess where the two intersect, and maybe each of you could say just a little bit more before I open it up, in the extraordinary debate that's taking place about taking carbon out of the atmosphere, that we have to not only stop producing emissions, we have to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. And my impression has been that agroecology has been one of the most promising ways to do this. And I just wonder if either or both of you could comment on this, and then we can open it up.
Mauricio, do you want to go first, or you want?
Go ahead, Fred. Yeah.
Well, basically, soil organic matter is essentially carbon. When they talk about soil carbon, you're talking about soil organic matter. And soil organic matter is at the heart of healthy soils. Organic matter in soil positively affects essentially all soil properties. Okay, so what has happened historically has been a tremendous decline in the amount of organic matter in soils, and that has caused all sorts of problems. Loss of biodiversity, by the way, it's a soil issue as well as above the soil. We want to have very diverse organisms in the soil being very active for many reasons I'd be happy to talk about. And the soil degradation has occurred partially because of this lack of organic matter, the decrease in organic matter. And again, why that has occurred, I'd be happy to talk about. So that one of the places that where carbon is stored is in the soil. There's about 3 times more carbon in soil than in the atmosphere. Okay. Of course, there's a lot of carbon stored in calcium carbonates and deposits in the deep ocean, etc. But as far as terrestrial, there's much more carbon in soils than in the organisms, plants and animals that are alive. So soil has been looked to as a place where maybe you could pull out carbon from the atmosphere and to sequester it, as they say, store it in soils. And I'm in general in favor of it because it's a good thing to do for other reasons, because you improve your soil. You have healthier soils if you build up organic matter and use the practices that build up organic matter, which are essentially agroecological practices. But what has happened also has been, there's some people have gone a little bit overboard and said, if you do certain things to the soil, you're going to be able to take all of the carbon that's now in the atmosphere and essentially all the extra carbon that's been emitted by industrial activity, by humanity, and we can store it in the soil. Well, that's just not going to happen, and it's certainly not going to happen in any foreseeable future. It's just an overestimate of what can happen. But there's been a lot of talk of that, about carbon sequestration in soils. So it's a little bit long-winded answer to Victor, but carbon in soils is a critical issue. We want to have soils that have lots of organic matter that's being decomposed by organisms, and therefore it needs to be replenished every year. And this helps to keep the biodiversity high in the soil, but it also helps to supply nutrients to keep the soil well structured, enable it to store water better, to accept water in the rainfall, intense rainfalls, etc. So it's one of the key issues in all of soils, is the role of organic matter in producing healthy soils. So practices that enhance that should be encouraged. And it so happens that that is, in essence, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it in soil, which is like a fringe benefit, if you would say.
Thank you, Fred. Yeah, Mauricio.
Very closely related to what Fred was saying. If in the last IPCC report, or one of the last, I think, it says that agriculture, forestry, and other land use constitute or contribute about 25% of the global's carbon emissions. So if properly managed, as Fred was saying, the soil can absorb large amounts of carbon. It has a huge potential to offset a lot of the yearly global fossil fuel emissions, which of course should be reduced anyway. But indeed, agroecology has a vast potential to reduce to suck out carbon from the atmosphere. and into the soil, into the healthy soils. And in addition to that, of course, it can reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus flows to the water, to the oceans or other water bodies on Earth, which also would help to restore those cycles too.
Great. Thank you, Mauricio. So I think now we can open it up, and maybe Cliff, you can moderate the questions, and we'll take it from there.
Okay. Yeah, I should say, first of all, that we have some people who are watching this on YouTube and do not have any way of getting a question to us directly. That's why I'm putting up on the screen an email address. You can send your questions to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will relay your questions then to our speakers. Others of you are in the Zoom room with the speakers, and you can present your questions more directly yourself. And so if you do have a question or comment that you would like to address to one or all of our speakers, wave at me. I have you all on gallery view, and if your video is on, you can wave at me. I'll see you and call on you to unmute yourself so that you can present your questions. While we're waiting for people to get their questions together, let me just pose one as a starter myself. Fred, you talked about the problems that stand in the way under capitalism of transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. But it has been pointed out that there are some things happening currently in capitalism that are actually promoting at least some transition in that direction. The lower cost of renewables now has made it competitive with coal-generated energy and making it perhaps even more competitive with oil-generated energy. In addition, the banks' financial capital is beginning to factor in risks based on the climate when they make decisions on where to invest, and that has potential of dampening the amount of investment going into fossil fuels. If the fossil fuel companies that have so much of their assets in the ground and don't want to abandon it, still seem to be talking as if they recognize that in the long run future, they need to diversify energy sources with renewable sources. So those are some factors that are underway that, and there's some indication that the new Biden administration is going to do something to help promote that transition toward non-fossil fuel, renewable energy sources. Any of our three speakers want to comment on those tendencies now existing within capitalism for jump-starting a greater reliance on renewable energies? Fred, I see you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are things happening, and you mentioned the price of wind and solar power has come down substantially over the last decade, and so I'm not. Of course, these things happen, but a transition that we're talking about, and actually, this actual decrease in the use of fossil fuels, which should really start now, not 10 years from now or not 5 years from now, it really should start now. This is something that is not going to happen because these companies they're just too damn powerful, and the whole system is created in a certain way. And in order to ramp up, I mean, if you look, I don't have the numbers on hand, but I've seen them in some articles and books. What would be needed in the way of wind power and solar power to replace the fossil fuels? The incredible numbers of facilities that would be needed around the world. This is a major undertaking of just unusual, unprecedented proportions. So, but that doesn't mean that certain things aren't happening. And I just want to use another analogy, if you're not analogy, but another example. In agriculture in the United States, I wrote an article in Monthly Review, the title of which was a rational agriculture. A rational agriculture is incompatible with capitalism. Okay, that doesn't mean that some practices which are good and ecologically sound aren't going to be used. And just as an example, there are farmers who are doing better rotations than they have been doing in the past. There are farmers that are using cover crops to keep the soil in place during the off season when they're not growing a commercial crop for sale. So there are practices that are being adopted relatively slowly, but it's still happening, so that you say, well, there are some improvements being made. Yes, it's true. But if we're talking about what needs to be done to transform a system, these are literally drops in the bucket.
Yeah, I would add one comment also, is that the renewables, the production of the renewables entails a lot of problems also, and the batteries that are needed to run electrically powered vehicles. So, for example, and the whole question of lithium and mining of lithium and imperialist control over the lithium mines and the health problems associated with that and so on. So you can't get away from the need to reduce the total amount of demand placed on these energy systems. And I'd mentioned that this was one of the themes of the film that many of you may have seen called Planet of the Humans, although it was controversial in many respects. I think the important point that it made was that there's no magic bullet in terms of just the energy sources. We can't get away from the need to reduce the total amount that's produced on a large scale.
Yes, related to that, it reminded me of this article by or research by Professor York here at the University of Oregon, who has shown that there's this discourse of that renewable energies will replace fossil fuels, but actually what you see is that rather than transitions, they are actually additions. Because there's not even if you develop a new renewable energy, you're relying on fossil fuels. That doesn't decrease as you would expect it to, because the aim of the system is to produce profit. So they utilize all ways of energy production for that end instead of for satisfying the society's needs, and you decrease in fossil fuels and you compensate that with a renewable. That's not what's happening in actuality, Professor York was actually interviewed by Moore in that Planet of the Humans that Victor was talking about, that I was going to mention.
Yeah, the situation is actually even more complicated here in Mexico, where energy policy has become a major focus of controversy, because AMLO, the president, is trying to save Pemex, the state-owned petroleum company. And to do that has been discouraging renewable energy sources, most of which are being promoted by foreign capital, investing in solar energy in Mexico, which under the energy reform passed during the Peña Nieto administration, that energy reform was opening the way to a transition to renewables, but it's being resisted by the state that has a vested interest in rescuing Pemex, its own fuel company, fossil fuel company. So it's not just the private capitalist corporations that can stand in the way. I'm looking for other hands. Someone else have a comment or question they'd like to raise?
There's a comment that's in the chat room, the last one that was added.
I haven't been looking at the chat, but we have a couple hands now.
Okay.
Let's call on Gregory first and then David Barkin.
Yes, thank you everybody for speaking so eloquently about agroecology and how important that is and where its successes are and of course the tremendous challenges. One very specific thing that I wanted to bring up, and there's so many that one could say, things one could say, but is that we see around the world a tremendous die-off of insects, bees, birds. Obviously, pollution from pesticides, it has to be a tremendous factor, but also new disease vectors. And not that I'm going to ask anybody to have a solution to it, but I just think it's a problem and a problem in agroecology. In some sense, Cuba may benefit from being isolated in some ways politically and you know, from the US policies, but the rest of the world, of course, you know, is part of the global excuse me, the global supply chain. All of these things do, you know, travel. You have invasive grass species which are in the United States as well as Australia and many other countries and contribute to the fires that we see in the forests and so forth. So I just, and bringing it up, I don't know if anyone, you know, has a comment on it, that these are challenges as we go forward ecologically that have to be faced. And I don't think can be diminished. I think they're going to increase more and more. And certainly reducing pesticide use as they did in Cuba so drastically out of necessity after the fall of the Soviet Union is important, but these disease vectors are another thing. And then we need insects, bees, birds, etc., for agricultural production and the health of our biosphere.
Fred.
I just want to add on to that. Let's not forget habitat destruction, which is also one of the major issues with regard to loss of biodiversity. And this happens, you know, by large-scale agriculture, cutting down forests. I mean, we've had around the world tremendous degree of habitat destruction. So, so I'm not contradicting what you just said, but I'm just adding to it.
Mm-hmm. As a footnote, I would just add that Cuba has developed a major export industry of organic honey to Europe because, you know, they have a healthy bee population apparently. Now I'd said I would call next on David Barkin, and after that then Liz Mestris. David, unmute yourself, please.
Hi there. I want to make a comment on your comment, Cliff, about what's going on in Mexico. Because while it's true that the government right now is trying to support Pemex, the problem with the renewable energy system in Mexico is one that's a very similar problem that's going on in the rest of the world. And that is that the energy is being produced by large-scale producers and is being delivered to large-scale consumers, at least in this country. And And that's really very, very important because the disagreement of the government with the way in which energy not only is produced, but is distributed in this country is that it's an extraordinary subsidy to large-scale producers, incredibly, a subsidy by the Federal Electricity Commission to the large-scale producers at the expense of small-scale, of household consumers and small industrial consumers. So I won't go into the particular details of that, but the energy reform of 2013 in this country was a giveaway to the large-scale renewable new installations of renewable energy in this country. I think there are lots of problems with energy policy in this country, but we really have to understand that the renewable energy system in this country has been established as another way of subsidizing capital rather than dealing with the problem of either of getting rid of fossil fuels or of providing cheaper energy for the people. It's really very important in the context of the discussion that we're talking about in this session, and I think it's been it's really good to see Fred face to face, even if we are 5,000 kilometers apart. And I look forward to getting to meet Mauricio, at least virtually. I sent you a mail. The underlying issue of how we can develop in Mexico right now, the kind of things that Mauricio's talking about, is also very, very much on the table. We are having a big debate, and it's the debate that I'm part of, and that is part of this discussion of this webinar that the Global Justice Center is so fabulously sponsoring. Because the question is, how do we make a transition in Mexico from an agriculture that is subsidizing the US consumers and US corporations and has an extraordinarily peculiar productive system? We're producing fruits and vegetables with water that the companies are being given for free and at labor that is being used at in subhuman conditions and at starvation wages or below starvation wages. So it is a question not only of celebrating the kind of slides that Mauricio showed, the celebration of a closing event and his meeting, but the debate and the struggles, the real class struggle that's going on in this country about large corporations versus small scale agriculture. And it's really extraordinarily important. Thank you.
Yeah, Fred.
David, I also, and everyone, I want to just add that renewables, especially solar, are extremely well suited to what's called distributed energy, to small scale projects that are around the country. They don't have to be large scale facilities that are put into place. And this offers, I think, tremendous opportunities for the poorer countries or the third world or whatever we're going to call them, that don't have maybe the the electrical transmission capacities built or or they're not sufficient, because this is a whole different ballgame from the point of view what can be done at the local level and what can be done at small scale. Just as agroecology can be done at the local level, has to be done at the local level, and at different scales. The same is true with renewable energy. It's a shame that it's being done with these huge systems that you're describing.
Well, but this is part of a global political struggle, and in our country, that's it's even being further poisoned by a new proposal for a nuclear power plant. I mean, it's absolutely incredible in 2021 that Mexico's even thinking or spending any money on studies for a new nuclear power plant.
Okay, Liz Mestris is next. While she unmutes, let me just put up on the screen the email address to send your questions to. So far, I haven't gotten any, but this is how you should do it. Okay, Liz.
Okay, I have just a brief question. I just recently saw a video with Walden Bello, which was entitled, "Is COVID an Opportunity for Food Sovereignty?" And his argument was based on the idea that the one side of the crisis is breaking down the global supply chains. It wasn't a terribly optimistic video, but I think because he was talking about the huge power of the food industry, but like the other things, we're going into some kind of economic crisis. We're in it, and we don't know how far it'll go. Or at least I don't. And when you're talking about Cuba, and actually I remember it seemed to be the same case in Nicaragua in the early days of turning to ecological agriculture when they couldn't access fertilizers and things like that. But at this point, food sovereignty is like, I believe the phrase was generated from Via Campesina, which has got 200 million members worldwide, organized in many, many countries, and it works on a global, national, and local level, which is, I find, hopeful. So anyway, I just wanted to comments on what you think about what are the opportunities. Walden Bello called that the silver lining. So I keep wanting to see one, so hopefully you can add to that.
I just make a brief comment. I think that it underscores the importance of local biodiversity, less dependent on long distance travel of all kinds. I mean, that's one of the things the pandemic has also brought up. I think it's very important. I would also mention, in terms of being proactive and going beyond just Liz's immediate question, there's been formed recently a global eco-socialist network, which is a world network of activists who are interested in these questions. They have exactly a website with that name, Global Eco-Socialist Network. They publish a newsletter, and they have international Zoom meetings, which is, I must say, one of the positive offshoots, if you're looking for some from the pandemic, is the prevalence of international Zoom meetings. So many things you can do that you couldn't do before. They have one about once a month, and it's 9 a.m. Eastern time, and you figure what time it is the rest of the world. But they're very interesting meetings with high-level activists from all over the world. Not very many. It's small enough you can get involved in the discussion, and it's really essentially a kind of catalyst, you might say, for activists who might be involved in various other organizations, because with the constant problem of how to get people motivated everywhere to be involved in this process.
Yes, and related to that, I don't know if it's it's not a silver lining directly related to COVID times, which might indeed close the hopefully the production consumption cycles within each country, and that will hopefully allow for agroecology to be developed more thoroughly. But I think I know at least some activism that I'm hopeful about is regarding Greta Thunberg and all of the youth, what they're doing. I mean, I have a lot of respect and admiration for what she's already accomplished, and hopefully in the post-COVID world, that'll be and keep being a very relevant voice, and then hopefully we'll gather more and more people and followers and organizing everywhere.
But on the food issue, I would suggest that the companies, these supply chains, etc., are very strong and very well established. And we could see that, yes, there was true. There was a real problem. I'm talking now. The place I know the best is the United States. I'm sure this is playing out differently in different places. But you had dairy farmers who were dumping milk because their milk that they were producing was going into schools, and the schools were closed, or going to restaurants, and the restaurants were closed. And so they had no way at that time to actually get it to people who needed it. So there are things like that, and it did definitely put quite a damper on the system. However, it has come through, and even though many people got sick and died in the meat packing plants in the Midwest, they kept open. You know, the president issued the orders, and they didn't even have to have social distancing, et cetera, and you have amazing loss of life. But the industrial food system kept going. So there was a temporary upset of the system, but I don't see that it's opened much for major changes. And there are stories about people who've said, well, you know, this really stimulated me to just want to buy locally. And so this has really helped small farmers. I'm talking about in the United States, and small processors. But I don't think it's going to be any way a challenge to the system itself, to the industrial food complex, if you will, itself. But it shows the need. It shows the rationale behind eating locally. Definitely.
George Polk has a comment in the chat box, but I see him here on my screen. If you unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, good. I tuned in late. I didn't hear anybody talk about forests and trees, but they are a large, an important part of the carbon and oxygen cycle. And I think that we've done a huge damage to them by removing the big and oldest trees all over the world. And we're in a pretty desperate shape with forests. And we have started a very small project in upstate New York to plant white oaks and white pines. That's where the original big trees up there. And people catch on to things like that. And it's a local kind of restoration that can be taught and people like to get involved with. And I think that I don't know if anyone has really calculated the carbon cycle as far as forests of, say, big sections or land or the world, Earth. And trees living 200 years or 300 years versus 50 years for many of the other kinds of trees that just rot and so forth. Thank you.
Any comments on that? Mexico has a big tree planting program. That's one of the initiatives that AMLO has undertaken, both for employment purposes, but also environmental.
There are major tree planting programs in Africa and China. I think, reestablishing forests is a very important goal. And trying to, we've had massive habitat upset in all sorts of habitats around the world, and trying to restore them is a very, very important goal. The carbon sequestration issue, yes, forests are an important, repository of carbon. The living part of the forest and the dead part, that is the organic matter, in the soil itself. But all of these things that sequester, I'm talking about living, that sequester carbon in soils or living in trees, you reach a maximum at one point, and after that, it doesn't change. So once you have a mature forest, and forests have been studied. I can't give you citations of the studies, but I know the carbon cycles in forests have been studied tremendously. But once you reach a maximum, that's it. You can store up to a certain amount of carbon in the living tree and below ground, and then the tree dies, starts to decompose, the carbon goes back in the atmosphere, younger trees are sucking it up, but it doesn't keep increasing and increasing and increasing. But for all sorts of reasons, habitat renewal and regeneration is critical.
Yeah,
Forests are great as long as they don't end up producing wildfires.
Yeah, but the grasses do that too.
About forest, I would also like to mention that, once again, in Cuba, that statistic I was talking about, I once saw a graph that I was trying to find where you see the forest land how it's changed through time over the last 500 years, ever since the colony, like the Spaniards settled in Cuba. And of course, there was a massive decrease to start harvesting sugarcane and so on, all the way to the agroecology period, when it has started to rise once again. And again, I think that one of the important, I won't say byproduct because it's deeply related to agroecology, one of the results that it may have is that it actually entails the forest growth. Like you can see in Cuba, almost 10%, that includes primary forest, other naturally regenerated forest, and planted forest. So of course that in turn is related to what Fred was mentioning of carbon, but also biodiversity conservation, as with the metapopulations theory of Levins and so on, how species can thrive if they can travel along patches of land of a regenerator or primary forest. And that has a lot of benefits in terms of biodiversity conservation too.
Well, we're running out of our time, but I did want to bring up one matter which Mauricio referred to, mentioning Greta Thunberg and the climate movement. Maybe as closing comments, does anyone want to say anything about the potential for the climate movement that was represented by Greta Thunberg and the climate strikes that we have seen around the globe? Politically, do you see that as having a positive effect?
Well, I can't say much directly, but I would say what it reflects is the heightened level of concern among the youngest people, and I think this is what we have to build on, and that's the constituency, I think, of greatest advances now, potentially now, in environmental awareness.
And also she has, generated some enthusiasm among older people. I mean, and just to see young people who are involved in the movement I'm talking about.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think this is as much of the troubles that we have socially and environmentally. These are opportune times for organizing because there are a lot of people concerned. There are a lot of people in these various different movements, so I think there are tremendous opportunities out there. There really are, and she's absolutely wonderful, no question about it.
Just before we came into this webinar, I saw the news item that President-elect Biden has appointed a special climate advisor in the White House. John Kerry will be representing initiatives on the climate front. Well, are there any closing words that any of our speakers want to give before we close this out? You've covered a lot of territory and covered it well. I want to thank each of our speakers for their informative presentations. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible through our website. And let's see. And you can also make donations, tax-deductible donations to the Center for Global Justice to support these. But I want to sign off now with a climate song that captures the spirit of the younger generation. See if I can pull it up here. Oop.
We need to wake up. We need to wise up. We need to open our eyes and do it now, now, now. We need to build. And we need to start right now.
And with that, I thank you again. And this is Cliff Durand signing off. Hope to see you next Monday for our next webinar on Medicare for All.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so how do you feel it went?